Hey everyone, tonight we're going on a journey unlike any other, across thousands of years and countless miles, to explore the history of human migration. From the first footsteps out of Africa to the vast global movements of today, this is the story of how we, as a species, have always been on the move. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this kind of slow, thoughtful storytelling is something you enjoy. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know what kind of content brings you comfort or curiosity. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always wonderful to see how this shared space connects people across the world. Now, take a breath, get comfortable, and let's begin tonight's quiet journey through time together, from start to sleep. Human history is a history of movement. From our earliest beginnings, people have been on the move. They traveled by foot, by river, by sea. They moved to escape danger, to seek food, to follow animals, to find better land. Migration is not a recent development. It is a defining feature of who we are as a species. Long before cities or borders existed, human beings walked across continents. They adapted to deserts, mountains, jungles, and frozen tundra. They crossed oceans and built lives in every corner of the earth. These migrations shaped languages, cultures, and civilizations. They connected people long before the word globalization existed. Today, migration remains part of life, but to understand it fully, we must go back to the beginning, to the time before writing, before kingdoms, before farming, to the age when humans first began to leave the land of their origin, Africa. This is the story of that journey. A slow, steady movement that would eventually cover the planet, a story of survival, adaptation, and discovery. This is the history of human migration. Prehistoric migrations, modern humans, known as Homo sapiens, are just one part of a long evolutionary story that began in Africa. But before our species appeared, earlier human ancestors had already begun to explore beyond the continent. The first significant migration out of Africa is believed to have taken place over 2 million years ago. The species responsible for this movement was Homo erectus. They were among the first hominins to walk fully upright and to use stone tools. Archaeological evidence shows that Homo erectus reached as far as Southeast Asia, with fossils discovered in places like Java and China. This early migration was slow, spreading over tens of thousands of years. Unlike modern humans, Homo erectus did not possess complex language or culture as we know it, but they had the ability to adapt to new environments. They followed animal herds, sought fresh water sources, and slowly expanded into unfamiliar lands. Their presence in Asia marks the first wave of human-like creatures to live outside of Africa. Much later, around 300,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans evolved in eastern Africa. These early Homo sapiens had more advanced brains, more refined tools, and likely used spoken language. For a long time, their range was limited to Africa, but around 70,000 years ago, they too began to move. The reasons for this second, larger migration out of Africa are still debated by scientists. It may have been triggered by changes in climate, by competition for food, or by simple population pressure. One widely supported theory is that a small population of Homo sapiens left eastern Africa and traveled through the Horn of Africa, crossing into what is now Yemen. From there, these early humans began to spread rapidly. Genetic and archaeological evidence suggests that by around 60,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had reached South Asia. Tools found in present-day India and Sri Lanka match the style of those from early African sites. Some groups followed the southern coast of Asia, eventually reaching Southeast Asia and Australia by about 50,000 years ago. This would have required sea travel across short distances, making early humans the first seafaring species. Meanwhile, other populations moved northward through the Levant and into Europe. They arrived in a region already inhabited by Neanderthals a close human relative. For thousands of years, Homo sapiens and Neanderthals coexisted. They even interbred, as shown by the presence of Neanderthal DNA in modern non African populations. Eventually, Homo sapiens became dominant, and Neanderthals disappeared from the fossil record around 40,000 years ago. By that time, modern humans had also reached Central Asia. From there, some groups began to move east into Siberia. Around 15 to 20,000 years ago, during the last ice age, sea levels were lower than they are today. A land bridge called Beringia connected northeastern Asia with Alaska. It is believed that small groups of humans crossed this bridge into the Americas. Archaeological evidence from sites in both North and South America suggests that humans were living across the continents by at least 13,000 years ago, and possibly earlier. These first Americans hunted large animals like mammoths and bison, but they also adapted quickly to forests, rivers, mountains, and coasts. By the end of the Ice Age, roughly 10,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had established themselves on every major continent except Antarctica. They lived in caves, built huts, created tools from stone, bone, and wood, and developed complex languages and cultural practices. They painted scenes of animals and hunts on cave walls, such as those found in Lascaux in France and in Chauvet Cave, which date back around 30,000 years. This period of human history, often called the Upper Paleolithic, was marked by innovation, mobility, and social development. People organized themselves into small bands or tribes, shared knowledge, and passed down stories from generation to generation. They worshiped nature, honored ancestors, and buried their dead with care. These early migrations laid the foundation for all human history to come. By adapting to diverse environments, forming communities, and developing new technologies, early humans set the stage for the next major transformation, the shift from a nomadic life to one rooted in place, a change driven not by movement, but by cultivation. The age of migration was far from over, but soon humans would begin to settle. The Neolithic Revolution and the first settlements. For tens of thousands of years, humans lived as hunter gatherers. They moved with the seasons, followed the migrations of animals, and gathered what the land gave them. They lived in small groups, often fewer than 50 individuals. Their lives were shaped by the rhythms of nature, the cycles of the moon, the turning of the stars. But around 12,000 years ago, something changed. This change did not happen in one place, or all at once, but it would forever alter the course of human history. We call it the Neolithic Revolution. In the Fertile Crescent, a region stretching from modern-day Iraq through Syria and into Israel and Jordan, humans began to domesticate plants and animals. This was one of the first places where agriculture developed. People began to cultivate wild grains like wheat and barley. They domesticated animals such as goats, sheep, and later cattle. They no longer had to rely entirely on the hunt. At first, farming was a supplement. Hunters planted a few seeds here and there, but over time, as techniques improved, some groups began to settle in one place. They built permanent homes from mud brick and stone. They stored surplus grain. They dug irrigation channels and learned to manage water. The first known agricultural village is often identified as Jericho, located in the West Bank. By around 9,000 years ago, Jericho had stone walls, towers, and a population in the hundreds. This was not just a camp, it was a community. Similar developments took place elsewhere. In the highlands of modern-day Turkey, at a site called Karalhog, archaeologists uncovered a city-like settlement dating back over 8,000 years. Here people lived in closely packed homes made of mud brick. They painted murals on their walls and buried their dead beneath their floors. There were no streets. People moved from roof to roof. Meanwhile, in China, along the Yellow River, people began to cultivate millet. In the south, along the Yangtze River, they domesticated rice. By 8,000 years ago, farming villages had appeared throughout East Asia. In sub Saharan Africa, people began cultivating sorghum and yams. In the Americas, agriculture developed independently. Maize, or corn, was first domesticated in Mexico around 9,000 years ago from a wild grass called teosinte. Beans, squash, and chili peppers followed. In the Andes, people grew potatoes and domesticated llamas and alpacas. This shift from foraging to farming was gradual. It took generations. It was not always smooth. Farming required more labor than hunting. It tied people to the land. It introduced new risks, crop failures, droughts, and social conflict. But it allowed for one thing that hunting could not: surplus. And with surplus came change. Larger populations could now be supported. Food could be stored for winter or for bad seasons. People began to specialize. Some became potters, others became toolmakers, weavers, or traders. New social structures emerged: elders, leaders, priests. Hierarchies began to form. Trade routes developed between settlements. Salt, obsidian, grain, and animals moved from village to village. So did ideas. Technology spread, but so did beliefs, rituals, and myths. Languages began to diversify and evolve. Human migration didn't stop during this period, it simply took a different form. Instead of wandering in search of prey, people now migrated with seeds and knowledge. Farming communities expanded into new territories, bringing agriculture with them. In Europe, agriculture spread gradually from the southeast to the northwest, beginning around 7,000 years ago. This movement took centuries. Local hunter gatherers sometimes adopted farming themselves. Sometimes they were absorbed by incoming populations. Recent genetic studies suggest that early European farmers were descendants of Near Eastern migrants who brought not only crops but also new technologies and cultural practices. This pattern, the slow spread of farming, mixed with movement and cultural exchange, repeated in many parts of the world. Wherever agriculture took hold, settlements grew. Villages turned into towns, towns into proto cities. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians built some of the earliest urban centers. By 5,000 years ago, cities like Uruk and Eridu rose along the banks of the Euphrates River. They had temples, markets, and administrative systems. Writing appeared, first as simple marks on clay tablets, then evolving into full cuneiform script. Migration during this era became more complex. It was no longer just about survival, it was also about trade, opportunity, and expansion. People moved to establish colonies, to escape overcrowding, or to explore new frontiers. By the end of the Neolithic period, the human world was transformed. Agriculture had taken root on every inhabited continent. Populations had grown, societies had diversified, and though people now lived in permanent settlements, migration remained part of life because humans, no matter how far they settle, still carry with them the impulse to move, to search, to connect, to begin again. Ancient migrations and the rise of empires. As agriculture took root and early cities emerged, human migration entered a new phase, no longer just survival driven. It became part of expansion, conquest, trade, and the building of civilizations. The ancient world is far more connected than it may seem. Rivers, mountains, deserts, and seas shaped the paths people followed. They walked, rode, sailed, and in doing so they spread culture, language, and power. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians were among the first to build cities. They attracted migrants from surrounding regions: farmers, laborers, craftsmen. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers were natural highways for both goods and people. As these early cities grew, they formed the first complex societies. To the west, in ancient Egypt, migration also played a central role. The Nile River Valley, with its predictable floods and fertile land, became a magnet for settlement. People from the deserts, the Levant, and Nubia moved into Egyptian territory. Over time, Egypt itself expanded through conquest, and its influence spread far beyond its borders. The Egyptians traded with peoples along the Red Sea and deep into Africa. They brought back incense, ivory, gold, and stories of distant lands. In the east, the Indus Valley civilization emerged in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. By around 4,000 years ago, cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were thriving. They had grid-planned streets, sewage systems, and evidence of long-distance trade. Goods and ideas moved between the Indus region and Mesopotamia, carried by migrating merchants and seafarers. Farther east, the early dynasties of China were taking shape. The Yellow River, sometimes called China's sorrow for its floods, supported the rise of the Shang dynasty. As these early states grew, they absorbed smaller tribal groups. Many of these groups migrated from the north and west, integrating into the cultural and political fabric of China. Migration here was often tied to the ebb and flow of warfare, climate shifts, and population pressure. In Europe, waves of migration brought Indo-European speaking peoples from the steppes north of the Black Sea into the heart of the continent. These migrations happened in several waves between roughly 4,000 and 1000 BCE. They brought with them new languages, bronze working technology, and the domesticated horse. These groups spread as far as Western Europe, Iran, and northern India, laying the linguistic foundation for many future civilizations. Today, most European and many Indian languages trace their roots to this shared ancestry. One of the most influential centers of ancient migration was the Mediterranean. Here, the sea served not as a barrier, but as a bridge. The Phoenicians, seafaring traders from the Levant, founded colonies across the Mediterranean coast. From their homeland, in what is now Lebanon, they established cities in North Africa, Spain, and Sicily, including the great city of Carthage. Their alphabet would later influence Greek and Latin writing systems. The Greeks themselves were great migrants. Facing limited farmland and their mountainous homeland, they established colonies across the Aegean and into southern Italy, the Black Sea coast, and North Africa. These Greek settlements spread Hellenic culture far and wide. Language, art, religion, and political ideas. They also created a network of interconnected cities that traded, competed, and sometimes clashed. Then came Rome. Originally a small city-state in central Italy, Rome expanded through conquest, diplomacy, and migration to become one of the most powerful empires in history. As Roman armies advanced, they brought settlers with them. Veteran soldiers were given land in newly conquered territories. Roman roads stretched from Britain to the Persian Gulf, and these roads carried more than legions. They carried merchants, teachers, craftsmen, slaves, and ideas. Rome was a multicultural empire. Its population was drawn from across the Mediterranean world and beyond. Latin mixed with local languages. Roman law adapted to different customs. Religious beliefs spread and blended. Christianity itself, once a persecuted faith, spread rapidly along Roman trade routes and roads. By the 4th century, it became the empire's official religion, carried by migrants, missionaries, and merchants. Migration in the ancient world was not always peaceful. Empires expanded by force, and many people were displaced. Slavery was widespread. Entire communities were uprooted and resettled. But even in these painful movements, cultures encountered one another. New identities formed. New languages emerged, and human history became more deeply interconnected. By the end of the ancient period, around the 5th century CE, the world was full of cities, kingdoms, and empires shaped by thousands of years of movement. The next era, the time of great migrations and upheaval, would see the fall of empires and the birth of new ones. And with it, human migration would once again take center stage, the great migrations in the medieval world. In the centuries following the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Europe and much of Asia experienced one of the most turbulent periods in the history of human movement. Historians call it the Migration Period. It began in the 4th century and lasted for several hundred years. It reshaped the map of Europe and changed the course of civilizations. One of the most significant forces of this time was the movement of the Germanic tribes. The Goths, Vandals, Lombards, Franks, and others had lived on the borders of the Roman world for generations. Some had served as soldiers in the Roman army, others had traded with Roman merchants or settled within imperial lands. But as pressure mounted from the east, these tribes began to move in larger numbers. That pressure came, in part, from the Huns. The Huns were a nomadic group from the steppes of Central Asia. Skilled horsemen and fierce warriors, they swept westward in the late 4th century. Their arrival displaced many other peoples, pushing them into Roman territories. In the year 376, the Visigoths crossed the Danube River seeking refuge from the Huns. Rome allowed them in, but tensions quickly escalated. In 378, the Visigoths defeated the Roman army at the Battle of Adrianople, a devastating blow to imperial power. By 410, they had sacked the city of Rome itself. It was the first time in 800 years that the Eternal City had fallen to an enemy. Elsewhere, the Vandals moved through Gaul and Spain and eventually crossed into North Africa, where they founded a kingdom that lasted nearly a century. The Angles, Saxons, and Jutes crossed the North Sea and settled in what is now England, displacing or absorbing the native Britons. These migrations were not single events. They happened over generations, often blending conquest with settlement. In the east, the Byzantine Empire, the eastern half of the old Roman Empire, managed to endure. Centered in Constantinople, it became a beacon of culture and learning. It also became a crossroads for migration and trade between Europe and Asia. Meanwhile, a new force was rising in the Arabian Peninsula. In the early 7th century, Islam emerged in the cities of Mecca and Medina. Within a century, Muslim armies and traders had spread across the Middle East, North Africa, and into Spain. This expansion was one of the most rapid in human history, but it was not only a military movement, it was also a migration of people, languages, and ideas. As the Islamic caliphates expanded, they created vast trade networks that stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the borders of China. Merchants, scholars, and pilgrims traveled these routes. Arabic became the lingua franca of science, philosophy, and commerce across much of the known world. The Islamic world was diverse, with Arabs, Persians, Berbers, Turks, and others sharing in its growth. To the north, the Turkic peoples began their westward movement from Central Asia. These nomadic groups, originally from the Altai region, migrated across the steppes, often serving as mercenaries or invaders. Eventually, one of their branches, the Seljuks, would become dominant in the Middle East. Another, the Ottomans, would later reshape southeastern Europe and the Mediterranean. In northern Europe, new seafaring migrants began to appear. They were called the Vikings. Between the late 8th and 11th centuries, Viking expeditions left their mark on Europe. Originating from Scandinavia, these Norse sailors raided, traded, and settled across vast distances. They attacked monasteries on the coasts of England and Ireland. They sailed up the rivers of France and Russia. They reached Iceland, Greenland, and even the coast of North America 500 years before Columbus. But the Vikings were more than just raiders. Many of them settled and integrated. In Normandy, they became the Normans. In Russia, they helped to found early Slavic principalities. In Ireland and England, they built towns and intermarried with locals. At the same time, the Silk Road flourished. This vast network of overland trade routes connected East Asia to the Mediterranean. It passed through deserts, mountains, and bustling caravan cities. Along its paths traveled not only silk, spices, and gold, but also people, traders, missionaries, pilgrims, and diplomats moved between cultures. Buddhist monks journeyed from India to China. Nestorian Christians reached as far as Central Asia and China. Jewish merchants from the Radhanite network traveled from Spain to Persia. Migration along the Silk Road was slow, but it was constant. It was the quiet rhythm of exchange across centuries. In sub-Saharan Africa, migration patterns also shifted. Bantu-speaking peoples continued to spread throughout Central and Southern Africa. Their movements, which had begun centuries earlier, brought agriculture, ironworking, and language across vast areas. Meanwhile, trans-Saharan trade routes connected West African kingdoms like Ghana and later Mali with the Islamic world. Camels made these journeys possible, moving salt, gold, books, and people across the great desert. The medieval world was a world in motion. Empires rose and fell, faiths spread, languages transformed, people fled war, sought opportunity, or followed the call of pilgrimage. Migration shaped the map of medieval civilization. It laid the foundations for future nations, for global trade, and for the contact between continents that would soon change the world. The age of discovery and colonization. By the late 15th century, the known world was on the verge of transformation. For thousands of years, human migration had moved across land and along coastlines. Now, driven by ambition, wealth, faith, and curiosity, humanity turned to the open sea. This was the beginning of the age of discovery, and with it came one of the most dramatic shifts in the history of human migration. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, sailing under the Spanish crown, crossed the Atlantic Ocean and reached the Caribbean. He was not the first to do so. Norse explorers had reached North America centuries earlier, but this voyage marked the start of a sustained transoceanic movement of people. The Spanish and Portuguese led the way. Portugal established trade outposts along the coasts of Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. They reached Brazil, where settlers, soldiers, and missionaries followed. Spain claimed vast territories in the Americas, from Mexico and Central America to the Andes and beyond. Within decades, European powers had carved out enormous colonial empires. Migration now became global. It was no longer limited to regional movements. It became intercontinental and irreversible. But the colonization of the New World brought with it both opportunity and devastation. Millions of indigenous peoples lived in the Americas before European arrival. Their civilizations, the Aztec, the Maya, the Inca, had built great cities, developed complex societies, and cultivated the land. European conquest brought war, disease, and displacement. Smallpox and other foreign illnesses spread rapidly. Within a century, large portions of the native population had perished. Entire cultures were lost. Others were forced to adapt or resist. At the same time, millions of Europeans began to migrate to the New World. Some sought fortune, gold, land, or trade. Others fled poverty, religious persecution, or conflict. Settlements rose along the Atlantic coast in the interior, and eventually on the Pacific shores. The English, French, Dutch, and later others joined the race for colonies. North America, the Caribbean, South America, Africa, and parts of Asia became theaters of migration and exploitation. A darker movement began as well, one of the most tragic in human history, the transatlantic slave trade between the 16th and 19th centuries More than 12 million Africans were forcibly taken from their homelands. They were captured, sold, branded, and packed into ships under inhuman conditions. Millions died during the journey across the ocean, known as the Middle Passage. Those who survived were sold into slavery across the Americas. They worked on plantations, in mines, and in colonial cities. Their labor built wealth for European empires and helped transform the global economy. Their descendants, scattered across continents, would form the roots of many modern nations. This forced migration was not only brutal, it was enduring. It left deep scars. It reshaped families, communities, and continents. It created the African diaspora, a global network of culture, resilience, and identity born from unimaginable suffering. At the same time, voluntary European migration to the Americas increased. In the 17th and 18th centuries, settlers came from Britain, Germany, France, and Scandinavia. Many sought religious freedom, others hoped to own land. Some arrived as indentured servants, bound to years of labor in exchange for passage. Entire societies were transplanted across the Atlantic. They brought with them their languages, religions, laws, and customs. Over time, these cultures blended with indigenous traditions and African heritage. New identities formed: Creole, Mestizo, Mulatto. Colonial societies became complex, unequal, and diverse. Beyond the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean world also changed. European powers established ports and colonies along the coasts of Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. The Dutch ruled parts of Indonesia. The British expanded into India. The French reached into Indochina. Migration in these regions was often linked to trade and military conquest, but it also involved administrators, traders, missionaries, and laborers. New cities grew, connected by sea routes rather than roads. Goods, ideas, and people flowed across oceans. In the Pacific, exploration continued. The Spanish reached the Philippines. The British sailed to Australia and New Zealand. Polynesians had long been masters of the sea, navigating vast distances in canoes long before European ships arrived. But now, migration in the Pacific would also become shaped by colonization. By the 18th century, the world was deeply interconnected. Migration had become global, structured, and often violent. People moved in search of land, freedom, or wealth. Others were moved against their will, enslaved, displaced, or exiled. The consequences of this age of migration are still with us. New languages emerged, new nations were born, empires rose on the backs of those who labored far from home. Humanity had crossed oceans, but the journey and the consequences were only just beginning. The Industrial Revolution and the rise of modern migration. The 19th century began with smoke on the horizon, not the smoke of war, though those would come, but the smoke of coal fires rising from new cities, new factories, and new machines. The world was changing again, and with it, the movement of people would take on a different shape. The Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain in the late 18th century, transformed not only how people worked, but where they lived. Rural families left the countryside for factory towns. Villages emptied as cities grew, machines replaced hand labor, and steam power replaced muscle and wind. This internal migration from farms to urban centers was one of the most significant in history. In England, Manchester, Birmingham, and London expanded rapidly. In Germany, the Ruhr Valley became a center of steel and coal. In the United States, cities like New York, Chicago, and Pittsburgh boomed. People migrated to where the work was. They lived in crowded tenements, often in poor conditions, but they came with hope, for a wage, for a future, for something more than survival. At the same time, long distance migration reached new heights. Europe was full of people. Population growth, combined with limited land and uneven wealth, pushed millions to leave. Between the year 1800 and 1920, more than 50 million Europeans emigrated. They crossed oceans in steamships heading to the Americas, to Australia, to South Africa, and beyond. The United States was the main destination. It became known as the land of opportunity. Immigrants from Ireland fled famine. Germans escaped political upheaval. Italians, Poles, Swedes, and many others sought work and land. At Ellis Island, just outside New York City, millions of arrivals passed through inspection stations. Some came with nothing but a name and a dream. They built railroads, worked in mines and factories, and started new lives in unfamiliar cities. Not all were welcomed. Anti immigrant sentiment grew alongside the migration waves. Laws were passed to restrict certain groups, but the flow continued. Across the Pacific, Chinese migrants came to the western United States, especially California, to work on railroads and in agriculture. They faced harsh discrimination and were eventually targeted by exclusion laws. But their labor helped to shape the American West. In Latin America, countries like Argentina and Brazil also attracted European settlers. Buenos Aires was once called the Paris of South America. Italian and Spanish immigrants blended with native populations to form new cultural identities. Elsewhere in the world, patterns of migration shifted with empire. Under British colonial rule, millions of Indians were sent abroad as indentured laborers. They worked on sugar plantations in the Caribbean, in Mauritius, in Fiji, and in East Africa. They signed contracts, often under pressure or misunderstanding, and were sent across oceans. Some returned after years, many stayed and built communities. Similar systems existed in French and Dutch colonies. Labor was needed where slavery had been abolished. Indentured servitude replaced it with new rules, but often with the same exploitation. The Russian Empire pushed its people eastward into Siberia. New railroads opened vast territories for settlement. Kazakhstan, the Far East, and Central Asia saw waves of Slavic settlers. Some went willingly, others were exiled. In Japan, after centuries of isolation, the Meiji Restoration brought rapid modernization. Economic pressures led many Japanese to migrate to Hawaii, to California, to Peru, and Brazil. Their communities would endure even in the face of discrimination and war. In Africa, colonial powers carved up the continent and moved people with little regard for borders or consent. Africans were forced into labor on plantations, in mines, and in colonial armies. European settlers claimed land and displaced local populations. In southern Africa, white farmers from Britain and the Netherlands established large estates. Black communities were pushed into labor camps or reserves. The technologies of the industrial age, steamships, railroads, telegraphs, made migration faster and more organized. You could now cross the Atlantic in weeks instead of months. You could write home, send money, and plan futures in faraway lands. But with speed came scale, and with scale came tension. Immigration policies hardened, nationalism rose, new nations worried about identity, borders, and loyalty. By the early 20th century, migration had become part of the political conversation, a question of belonging, of labor, of fear, and of power. Yet, despite the obstacles, people continued to move for work, for safety, for freedom. They carried language, religion, food, and memory. They brought change to themselves and to the places they went. The modern world, with all its cities and nations, its industries and ideologies, was built by migration, by those who left, by those who arrived, and by those who stayed and adapted. And as the 20th century approached, another great wave was about to begin. shaped not by machines, but by war. Migration in times of war and the aftermath of conflict. The 20th century began with promise and movement, but it soon turned into one of the bloodiest centuries in human history. War, revolution, and genocide forced millions of people to flee their homes. Migration was no longer just a journey of hope. It became a necessity, a means of survival. World War I erupted in 1914. It was a war unlike any before, fought with trenches, gas, and machines. By the time it ended in 1918, entire empires had collapsed. Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, Imperial Russia, and the German Empire all disappeared from the map. With their collapse came redrawn borders and massive displacement. In Eastern Europe, new countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia emerged. But they were home to diverse populations: Poles, Ukrainians, Germans, Jews, Hungarians, Serbs, Croats. Suddenly, many found themselves as minorities in newly formed states. Tensions grew. Some migrated voluntarily, others were pushed out or persecuted. In the former Ottoman lands, particularly in Anatolia, the conflict between Turks and Armenians escalated into one of the first genocides of the modern era. Between 1915 and 1923, over 1 million Armenians were killed or deported by the Ottoman authorities. Those who survived fled to Syria, Lebanon, Russia, France, and the United States. The Armenian diaspora, as we know it today, was born in those years of terror. The Russian Revolution of 1917 triggered another wave of displacement. Millions fled the Bolsheviks, aristocrats, intellectuals, merchants, and soldiers. Some escaped to Europe, to China, or to the United States. Others were exiled within Soviet borders. It was a time of political purge and class persecution. Between the wars, migration continued, driven by economic collapse and rising fascism. The Great Depression of the 1930s plunged millions into poverty. Borders tightened, but desperation grew. Then came World War II, and with it, the largest forced migration in human history. When Nazi Germany invaded Poland in 1939, war spread across Europe and beyond. Entire cities were bombed. Millions were uprooted. Some fled ahead of advancing armies. Others were captured and transported. The Holocaust targeted Jews, Roma, disabled people, and other minorities. 6 million Jews were murdered in ghettos, camps, and forests. Many tried to flee before the war, but a few countries opened their borders. Those who escaped went to Palestine, the United States, Latin America, or Shanghai, one of the few places that did not require a visa. During the war, millions of civilians were deported for forced labor. The Nazi regime moved people from occupied territories to work in German factories and farms. In the East, Soviet authorities did the same. Entire populations were relocated, including the Crimean Tatars, Chechens, and Volga Germans. As the war ended in 1945, the scale of displacement was unprecedented. More than 60 million people were refugees or stateless. Cities lay in ruins. Families were scattered. The Allied powers began one of the largest resettlement operations in history. German-speaking populations were expelled from Eastern Europe. Between 12 and 14 million ethnic Germans were forced to leave Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and elsewhere. Many died during the journey. Others arrived in a broken, divided Germany. In Asia, the defeat of Japan brought its own upheaval. Japanese settlers in Korea, Taiwan, and Manchuria were sent home. The partition of Korea created two hostile states. Millions were caught in between. One of the most dramatic post-war migrations occurred in South Asia. In 1947, British India was divided into two independent nations, India and Pakistan. The partition was sudden, violent, and chaotic. Hindus and Sikhs fled from Pakistan into India. Muslims fled from India into Pakistan. It's estimated that 15 million people were displaced in just a few months. At least 1 million died in communal violence. It remains one of the largest and most traumatic migrations in modern history. Meanwhile, the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 marked another turning point. Following the horrors of the Holocaust, the United Nations approved the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. The decision led to war with neighboring Arab states and to the displacement of over 700,000 Palestinian Arabs. They became refugees in Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, and Gaza. The conflict continues to shape the region to this day. The second half of the 20th century saw the collapse of European colonial empires. As colonies gained independence in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, new migration patterns emerged. In Algeria, a bloody war of independence from France ended in 1962. Over 1 million French settlers, known as Pieds Noirs, left the country. Thousands of Algerians who had fought for France also migrated, often facing discrimination in their new home. In East Africa, the end of British rule led to the expulsion of Indian communities who had lived there for generations. Many migrated to Britain or Canada. In Zimbabwe, the post-independence government pressured white farmers to leave. Similar tensions occurred in Uganda under the regime of Idi Amin. Decolonization also led to a wave of immigration into Europe. Former colonial subjects moved to the metropole, to Britain, France, the Netherlands, Belgium. They came as citizens or workers, rebuilding cities damaged by war. London, Paris, Amsterdam, and Brussels became home to diverse global populations. In the United States, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 ended racial quotas. New waves of migrants came from Latin America, Asia, and the Caribbean. The country grew more diverse, more urban, and more connected to the world. Elsewhere, the Cold War created new borders and new refugees. In Germany, the Berlin Wall divided families for decades. In Vietnam, after the war ended in 1975, hundreds of thousands fled by boat, risking everything on the open sea. Many were accepted as refugees in the United States, Australia, and Europe. The 20th century ended with hope and uncertainty. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and its republics became independent. Ethnic Russians left Central Asia and the Baltics. Wars broke out in the Balkans, in Bosnia, Croatia, and Kosovo, displacing millions once again. Each of these movements was shaped by power, identity, and survival. Migration was no longer a slow drift. It had become a flood, often tied to tragedy. But even amid the violence, people carried their cultures forward. They rebuilt lives, they passed on stories, they endured contemporary migration in a globalized world. As the new millennium began, the movement of people did not slow down. If anything, it accelerated. The 21st century is defined by mobility, by airplanes crossing continents, by ships traversing oceans, and by digital networks that bind cities and communities across the globe. But even as the world grew more connected, many people still moved for the oldest reasons of all: war, hunger, fear, hope. In 2011, civil war broke out in Syria. What began as a protest movement quickly escalated into a complex, multi-sided conflict involving local militias, international powers, and ideological rivalries. Cities were destroyed, families torn apart, more than 13 million Syrians were displaced. Over 6 million fled the country to Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and eventually Europe. In 2015, the Syrian refugee crisis reached its peak. Images of overloaded boats in the Mediterranean filled the news. Thousands drowned trying to reach Europe. Others walked for weeks, through forests, across borders, carrying children and memory. Germany opened its doors to over 1 million refugees. Other countries followed, some with welcome, some with resistance. But Syria was not alone. In Afghanistan, decades of war had displaced millions. In South Sudan, ethnic conflict and famine forced people into refugee camps. In Myanmar, the Rohingya minority, a Muslim population in a Buddhist majority nation, were persecuted and driven from their homes in what the United Nations described as ethnic cleansing. Hundreds of thousands crossed into Bangladesh, where they now live in sprawling camps. By the 2020s, there were over 100 million forcibly displaced people worldwide. It is the highest number in recorded history. Some are refugees who crossed international borders. Others are internally displaced within their own countries. Still, others are stateless. People with no recognized nationality, no passport, no legal place to belong. Migration in the 21st century is not only driven by conflict. Climate change has become an increasingly powerful force. Rising sea levels, droughts, floods, and storms are transforming once livable regions into dangerous or uninhabitable places. In low-lying island nations like the Maldives, Tuvalu, and Kiribati, entire communities face the threat of permanent disappearance beneath the waves. In sub-Saharan Africa, desertification pushes pastoralists off their ancestral grazing lands. In Central America, hurricanes destroy homes, crops, and futures. These climate migrants often move within their own countries, from rural areas to cities, but some seek refuge across borders. Scientists estimate that by the middle of this century, tens of millions of people may be displaced by climate related causes. But unlike refugees of war, climate migrants have little legal protection under international law. At the same time, economic migration continues to shape the modern world. Every day, people leave their homes not because of violence or disaster, but to seek opportunity for work, for education, for a better life. This is especially true in rapidly urbanizing regions of the global south. In Asia, cities like Jakarta, Mumbai, Manila, and Dhaka absorb millions of rural migrants each decade. In Africa, Lagos, Nairobi, Kinshasa, and Addis Ababa expand at breathtaking speed. In Latin America, Sao Paulo, Bogota, and Mexico City draw people from the countryside, creating megacities full of energy and contradiction. International labor migration remains vital to the global economy. Millions of workers from South and Southeast Asia migrate to the Gulf states, to Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar, where they build skyscrapers, serve in homes, and keep the engines of the economy running. Many face exploitation, poor living conditions, and few rights. Yet they send billions of dollars in remittances back home. Money that sustains entire communities. In Europe, migrants from North Africa, the Balkans, and Eastern Europe move westward for seasonal or long-term work. In North America, Latin American migration continues to shape the United States and Canada. Undocumented migrants work in agriculture, construction, and service industries. They live in the shadows, yet form the backbone of essential labor. In China, internal migration has created a floating population of over 200 million people, rural workers who move to cities but lack full urban residency rights. They build the cities, yet often live on the margins. Migration is not only physical, digital technologies have changed how people move, connect, and stay in touch. A migrant in Berlin can talk to family in Kabul in real time. Diasporas are now networked, organizing across borders, building virtual communities, and influencing both host and origin countries. Second generation migrants navigate complex identities. They grow up speaking multiple languages, balancing heritage and modernity, negotiating belonging in hybrid spaces. They often face discrimination, but also create new forms of art, activism, and culture. Immigration politics, however, remain polarized. In many countries, migration is a flashpoint. Far right parties rise on anti immigrant rhetoric. Walls are built, boats are turned away, laws tighten. Yet, despite this, the movement continues. People keep crossing borders, they keep building lives, they keep dreaming. Migration is a human constant, but the 21st century forces us to reimagine how we approach it. How do we balance security with compassion? How do we protect the vulnerable while managing resources? How do we plan for a future where movement is not the exception, but the norm? In cities across the world, stories of migration are written every day, in cafes, in factories, in classrooms, on construction sites. They are stories of struggle and joy, of homes lost, and new homes made. As we face the challenges of a changing climate, political instability, and economic inequality, one truth remains. We're a migratory species. We move, we adapt, we survive. And perhaps we can also learn from the past, from each other, and from the long road that brought us here. Migration as the story of humanity, across time, across deserts, forests, mountains, and oceans, we have moved, sometimes alone, sometimes in great waves, sometimes with joy, sometimes with sorrow, but always forward. Migration is not a side note in our history. It, it is our history. From the first humans who walked out of Africa following game and rain, to the families today boarding flights, crossing rivers, or waiting in refugee camps, the story is the same at its core: a search for something better, for food, for safety, for dignity, for a future. Borders have changed, empires have risen and fallen, languages have evolved, religions have spread, cities have been built and rebuilt. Yet through it all, people have carried memories and stories from one place to another. They have brought music and spices, tools and beliefs, customs and dreams. The world as we know it today, its diversity, its culture, its richness, is the result of that movement. Migration is not just movement through space, it is transformation through time. Each journey leaves traces in surnames, in accents, in recipes, in architecture. Sometimes the traces are visible: a neighborhood built by newcomers, a language infused with borrowed words, a market full of foreign fruits. Other times the traces are quieter: a lullaby passed down for generations, a prayer whispered in a tongue now forgotten, a longing for a homeland never seen, but deeply felt. The 21st century challenges us to think differently about movement, to ask what it means to belong, to understand that the line between migrant and settler, between guest and host, is often thin and shifting, that we are more connected than divided, and perhaps to accept that home is not always one place. It can be many places. It can be a memory, a person, a feeling. It can be carried in heart, in habit, in story. Let us remember this, especially in times of fear and division, that behind every migrant is a name, a family, a story, a hope, and that to be human is to move, to seek, to dream, to remember, and to continue. And so, as our journey through time comes to a close, we're reminded that migration isn't just a chapter in our history, it's the thread that weaves it all together. From ancient footsteps across deserts to families boarding planes today, movement has always defined what it means to be human. We search, we settle, we remember, and we move forward. Wherever you are tonight, whether far from home or right where your roots began, may you carry with you the quiet knowledge that you're part of something timeless. Thank you for spending this time with me. If you enjoyed this gentle exploration, consider subscribing for more journeys like this one. Until next time, rest well, stay curious, and good night.